The dresses on the clothesline were the first thing he saw. Bright splashes of calico, blue and yellow, snapping in the dry Nevada wind. They were an impossible sight, a flag of domestic life planted in the heart of a dead memory. Caleb Thorne reined in his dark brown horse, the leather of his saddle creaking in the sudden stillness. 10 years. 10 years he'd been gone, and for all 10 of those years this place was supposed to be empty, decaying back into the dust from which his father had raised it. He had come back not to live, but to sell, to sign a piece of paper, take what little coin he could get, and erase this corner of the map from his mind forever. But the dresses argued otherwise. Therefore he urged his horse forward, his eyes narrowing. The old clapboard house, which he remembered as gray and peeling, looked solid. The windows, once dark and vacant, were clean. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney. Someone was home. His home. A cold knot formed in his gut, a feeling he recognized from a life he'd tried hard to leave behind. It was the feeling of a complication, of a plan going sideways before it had even begun. He dismounted, the dust puffing up around his worn boots. As his feet hit the ground, the front door of the house opened. A woman stepped out onto the porch. She was Chinese, slender and straight-backed, holding a long-handled garden hoe like a sentry's rifle. Her hair was tied back severely, and her face, though unlined, held a watchfulness that was ancient. She did not look afraid. She looked anchored. Caleb stopped at the foot of the porch steps, his shadow stretching long in the afternoon sun. He took off his hat, not out of courtesy, but to get a better look. "This is the Thorne Ranch," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. The woman's gaze was direct. "I am aware." Her English was clear, with only a slight musical accent. It was better than the English of most men he knew. "I'm Caleb Thorne." He expected a reaction. Surprise, maybe fear. The name Thorne, tied as it was to a single, bloody afternoon in a town 2 territories over, usually got a reaction. He got nothing. Her expression did not change. "The land has been sleeping," she said, her eyes sweeping over the valley behind him. "I have been waking it." The simple poetry of her words threw him off. He had come here for a transaction, a clean and simple severing. He was prepared for squatters, for drifters he'd have to run off with a harsh word or a show of force. He was not prepared for this quiet woman with a farmer's hoe and a philosopher's turn of phrase. "I'm selling the place," he stated, forcing the conversation back onto solid ground. "You need to be gone." She considered his words, her eyes finally settling on his face. She seemed to be measuring him, weighing something he couldn't see. "I see," she said. It was not an agreement. It was an acknowledgement of a fact, like noting the position of the sun. "I need you gone by the end of the week," he said, the words sounding harsher than he intended. "A week," she repeated, the first flicker of something, not panic but calculation, entering her eyes. "I will need a week." He was a man who had learned that mercy was a liability. He had survived by making hard choices quickly and without regret. But looking at this woman, standing on the porch of a home that was his but felt like hers, he felt a strange hesitation. A week was a delay he didn't want, but the thought of turning her out into the wilderness with nothing, today, felt like a cruelty he wasn't in the mood to commit. "1 week," he confirmed, his voice tight. "I'm riding into Argenta to see the land agent. When I get back, I expect you to be packing." He turned to go, feeling her eyes on his back. His plan was simple. Register the intent to sell, post the notice, and wait for the inevitable low offers to trickle in. The land was poor, the water rights questionable. He'd be lucky to get a few $100s for the 80-acre plot. But it would be enough to buy a ticket on a train heading east and never look back. As he reached his horse, a question pricked at him. He turned back. "Who told you that you could stay here?" The woman's posture softened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Abernathy," she said. Caleb froze, his hand on his horse's neck. The name hit him like a physical blow. Thomas Abernathy. His father's old foreman, a man as gnarled and tough as the desert scrub. A man who had taught Caleb how to track, how to read the sky, how to be at home in this harsh landscape. A man who, according to the last letter Caleb had received from anyone in this valley, had died of a fever 5 years ago. He stared at the woman on the porch, a sudden, chilling dislocation settling over him. How could a dead man have given her permission to be here? The ride to Argenta was hot and dusty. Caleb's thoughts churned, replaying the woman's words. Mr. Abernathy. It was impossible. The man was gone. Perhaps she had lied, picked a name she might have heard in passing. But the way she'd said it felt too simple to be a lie. It felt like the truth. Therefore, the truth itself was the problem. Argenta was little more than a single dusty street servicing the railroad workers and the few ranchers stubborn enough to try and scratch a living from the valley. As Caleb rode down the main thoroughfare, 2 men on horseback blocked his path. They were broad-shouldered and wore their pistols tied low, a sign of men who expected to use them. "That's a fine horse," the taller one said, his eyes lingering on Caleb's mount. "You new to these parts?" "Just passing through," Caleb said, keeping his hands in plain sight on the pommel of his saddle. "This valley is mostly owned by Mr. Croft," the second man said, his voice a low rumble. "If you're looking to buy or sell, he's the man to see. Saves everyone a lot of time." It was not a suggestion. It was a warning, delivered with the casual arrogance of men who were used to being obeyed. "I'll keep that in mind," Caleb said, his gaze level. He nudged his horse, and after a tense moment, the men parted to let him pass. He didn't look back, but he could feel their eyes on him all the way to the land office. The encounter left a sour taste in his mouth. He had come here to untangle himself from the world, but the world was already reaching out to tangle with him. The land office was a small, sweltering room that smelled of dry paper and stale sweat. Behind a heavy wooden counter, a clerk with a green eye shade was poring over a large ledger. Sitting in the only chair in the room, as if holding court, was a man in a clean, dark suit. He was in his 50s, with silvering hair and a neatly trimmed mustache. His hands were soft, his boots polished. When he saw Caleb enter, he smiled a predator's smile. "Well, well," the man said, rising from his chair. "A new face. Don't get many of those. Jasper Croft." He extended a hand. Caleb ignored it. "I'm here to file a notice of sale for the Thorne homestead." The clerk looked up, startled. Croft's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "The Thorne place? I thought that was abandoned. Heard old man Thorne passed years back, and the son was long gone. Or dead." "The son is back," Caleb said flatly. Croft's eyes flickered over Caleb's worn clothes, the dust on his shoulders, the hard set of his jaw. He was making a calculation. "Is that so? Well, I might be interested in taking it off your hands. It's a poor piece of land, of course. Water's unreliable. But for the sake of neighborliness, I could offer, say, $200. He named the figure as if it were a grand act of charity. It was a blatant insult. The land was worth 5 times that at least, and the men outside were Crofts. This was a coordinated squeeze. "The price is 1,000, Caleb countered, picking a number out of the air. Croft laughed, a short, barking sound. 1,000? For what? A run-down shack and a ghost? I hear you've got a squatter problem out there. A a little Chinese woman. That complicates things, lowers the value. He leaned in, his voice dropping. Tell you what, you sign it over to me for $300, and I'll handle the complication. Cleanly. The veiled threat hung in the air. Caleb felt a cold fire ignite in his chest, an old and dangerous feeling. He had come here to run from his own history, not to get involved in someone else's fight. But Croft's smug assumption of power, his casual dismissal of the woman on the ranch as a complication to be handled, struck a nerve. The land is not for sale, Caleb said, the words surprising even himself. Not to you. He turned and walked out of the office, leaving a stunned silence behind him. The deal was off. He was no longer a seller. He was something else, though he wasn't sure what. As he mounted his horse, he knew Croft's men would be watching. He knew this was not the end of it. The ride back to the ranch felt different. He was no longer riding away from a problem, but toward one. When he arrived, the sun was low, painting the valley in shades of orange and purple. He found the woman, Mei Lin, not packing, but driving a new post into the ground to reinforce the small corral that held a pair of goats. Her movements were efficient, the swing of the heavy mallet precise. She had tied the rails to the post with a series of intricate knots. He recognized them. He hadn't seen knots like that since he was a boy working on a freighter out of San Francisco, before he'd ever come to this desert. "Where did you learn to tie a bowline like that?" he asked, his voice quiet. She didn't look up from her work. "My father was a fisherman on a great river you have never seen." Her answer was simple, direct, and opened up a world of questions he didn't know how to ask. He was still processing this when the sound of approaching horses broke the evening quiet. 2 riders, Croft's men. They weren't coming to talk this time. They rode straight for the corral, their intentions clear. "Last chance, old man," the taller one shouted. "Get off this land, and take the stray with you." He spurred his horse toward the goats, intending to scatter them, to break the small semblance of order Mei Lin had built. Caleb's body moved before his mind could object. He had no gun. He'd sold his rig years ago as a promise to himself. He grabbed the handle of the mallet Mei Lin had been using and ran to intercept the rider. He was rusty, his timing off. He swung the mallet, but the rider dodged, laughing. The second man dismounted and came at Caleb on foot. It was a clumsy, brutal fight. Caleb landed a punch that split the man's lip, but the man was heavier and drove him back against the fence. The air rushed out of Caleb's lungs. He saw the other rider circling, ready to trample him. This was it, he thought. A stupid end, in a place he didn't even want, for a woman he didn't even know. Then, a sharp, metallic click cut through the chaos. Both of Croft's men froze. Caleb looked up. Mei Lin was standing on the porch. She was holding an old, long-barreled shotgun. It was a fowling piece, ancient and heavy, probably hadn't been fired in 20 years. But the way she held it, braced against her hip, steady as a rock, left no doubt about her intent. She did not aim at either man. She aimed at the dust a few feet in front of the horseman's mount. "The next one," she said, her voice carrying with absolute clarity in the still air, "will be higher." The horseman stared at her, his bravado gone, replaced by disbelief. He looked at his partner on the ground, then back at the small woman with the very large gun. He spat on the ground. "This ain't over," he snarled, but there was no conviction in it. He helped his partner up, and they mounted their horses and rode away, a cloud of angry dust in their wake. The silence they left behind was profound. Caleb pushed himself off the fence, his ribs aching. He looked at Mei Lin, who was still holding the shotgun, her eyes on the retreating riders. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice raspy. She lowered the heavy gun, her arms trembling slightly from the weight. "It was in the house," she said, "with Mr. Abernathy's things." The name again. The ghost in the machine. Caleb looked from the shotgun to the woman, a new understanding dawning. He'd come here to sell a worthless piece of land. But Croft's aggression and this woman's quiet defiance suggested he was wrong about what this place was worth. "They will be back," she said, her gaze turning to the far end of the property. "Mr. Croft does not want this land." She pointed with the barrel of the gun. "He wants the water." Caleb followed her gesture. He saw the thin green line of cottonwoods, a line he'd forgotten all about. They marked the path of a creek, a small stream that trickled down from the mountains. He had always assumed it ran dry in the summer like all the others. But if it didn't, if it was spring-fed and ran year-round, then this wasn't just a dusty 80-acre plot. It was the most valuable piece of land in the entire valley, and he had just tried to give it away. That night, the house was filled with a tense silence. Mei Lin lit a single kerosene lamp, casting long, dancing shadows across the small kitchen. The room was sparse, but immaculate. She moved with a quiet grace, preparing a simple meal of rice and dried vegetables, while Caleb sat at the small wooden table, cleaning and oiling the old shotgun. His knuckles were bruised, and his side throbbed where he'd hit the fence. The shotgun was in surprisingly good condition, cared for. "You said Abernathy let you stay," Caleb finally said, breaking the quiet. "The last I heard, Tom Abernathy died 5 years ago." Mei Lin placed a bowl of tea in front of him. The steam was fragrant. She sat down opposite him, her hands folded on the table. "My husband Chin worked on the railroad," she began, her voice soft. "He helped build the great trestle over the canyon. There was an accident. A cable snapped. The company called it an act of God. They gave me $20 and told me to be grateful." She paused, her eyes distant, seeing a memory he could only imagine. "I had nowhere to go. I came to Argenta. I was lost. An old man found me sleeping near the station. He was a prospector," he said. "His clothes were ragged, but his eyes were kind. He bought me a meal. He listened to my story. He told me he knew of a place, a good house with a solid roof and a well that never ran dry. He said the owner was a boy who had run off years ago, probably dead in a ditch somewhere. He said the place needed a soul in it, or it would die too." Caleb stopped his work, the oily rag still in his hand. He knew what was coming. "He gave me a piece of paper," she continued. "He wrote on it so that if anyone asked, I would have something to show." She rose and went to a small wooden chest in the corner. From it, she retrieved a folded, yellowed sheet of paper and handed it to him. Caleb unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was faint and spidery, the hand of an old man whose strength was failing. But it was unmistakably Tom Abernathy's hand. The note was simple. "Let the bearer, Mrs. Lin, reside at the Thorne homestead. The place needs a soul in it. Forgive an old man's presumption. T. Abernathy." It wasn't a deed. It wasn't legal. It was just a kindness. Caleb stared at the paper, the truth rearranging itself in his mind. Abernathy hadn't died. He had just walked away. A prospector to the end, chasing one last dream, and on his way out, he had given away a home that was never his to give, to a woman who had nothing. A strange mix of anger and awe filled Caleb. Anger at the old man's audacity, and awe at his compassion. He wasn't wrong, Caleb said, his voice thick. He looked at Maylin, truly seeing her for the first time. Not as a squatter, not as a complication, but as the soul Abernathy had spoken of. The place needed it. The tension between them dissolved, replaced by a fragile, unspoken understanding. He was a man running from his past. She was a woman trying to build a future. They were both stranded here, tied to this piece of land by the ghost of an old man. The understanding was shattered the next morning by the arrival of 3 riders. This time, Jasper Croft was with them. The third man wore the badge of a U.S. Marshal. Croft was done with thugs. He was using the law now. "Thorne," the marshal said, his voice devoid of emotion. He was a tall, lean man with a sun-weathered face. "I have a notice of seizure for this property." Croft smiled, holding up a sheaf of papers like a winning hand. "It seems," he said with relish, "that you've been a little negligent. Territorial taxes on this land haven't been paid in 10 years. The total, with penalties and interest, comes to $1,250. Caleb felt the blood drain from his face. It was an astronomical sum. "According to territorial law," the marshal continued, "you have 48 hours to pay the debt in full, in cash. If you fail to do so, the property is seized by the territory and will be sold at public auction to the highest bidder." "And I," Croft added smoothly, "will be the highest bidder. In fact, I'll be the only bidder." He looked around at the dusty yard, the small house, the woman standing silently on the porch. "However, I'm a reasonable man. Sign the deed over to me right now for my original offer, $300. I'll settle the tax debt myself, and you can walk away with something in your pocket." It was a perfect trap. Legal. Airtight. He could take Croft's offer, pay off his own ghost, and leave. It was what he had come here to do. But it would mean handing this valley's water to a man like Croft, and it would mean turning Maylin out with nothing. He looked at Croft's smug, triumphant face. He looked at the impartial, unyielding face of the law. Then he looked at Maylin. Her expression was calm, resolute. She was not pleading. She was watching him, waiting to see what kind of man he was. The gunslinger he had tried to bury for a decade stirred. The part of him that stood his ground, that faced down bullies, that had earned him a name he hated. He turned to the marshal. "I'll have the money," he said. The words hung in the air, a declaration of war he had no way of winning. Croft's smile faltered for a second, replaced by a flicker of angry surprise. The marshal simply nodded. 48 hours, Thorne." As they rode away, Caleb was left standing in the yard with the weight of an impossible promise. He had no plan. He had no money. He had just made a choice that had cost him his escape, and he had no idea what it would gain him. Caleb had only one asset left from his former life, and it wasn't money. It was a name, and a debt owed. He saddled his horse, the fine animal that Croft's man had coveted. "Watch the place," he said to Maylin. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of trust. She simply nodded, her hand resting on the frame of the kitchen door. He rode hard for Argenta, the dust of his own urgency chasing him. He didn't go to the land office or the saloon. He went to the small telegraph office at the edge of town. For a long time he stood before the counter, composing the words in his head. A telegram was a desperate shot in the dark, expensive and uncertain, but it was the only shot he had. He paid the clerk with a few of his last silver dollars and handed him the message, addressed to a Mr. Alistair Finch in San Francisco, care of Finch Shipping. Alistair Finch was a man whose life Caleb had saved in a dockside brawl years ago, a brawl that had nothing to do with honor and everything to do with bad whiskey and worse luck. Finch, already a wealthy man, had sworn he was in Caleb's debt. Caleb had never planned to collect. The message was stark. Need backing against land grab, Redemption Valley, water rights at stake. Your terms, Thorn. The clerk tapped out the message, the clicks echoing in the quiet room. Now, all Caleb could do was wait. The reply would have to come from San Francisco to the territorial hub in Carson City, then be relayed to Argenta. It could take a day. It might never come at all. The next 36 hours were the longest of Caleb's life. He and Mei Lin worked in a state of suspended dread. They didn't speak of the deadline. Instead, they worked. They shored up a loose section of the barn roof. They cleared stones from the patch of earth Mei Lin used as a garden. They moved with a shared, unspoken purpose, as if by imposing order on the land, they could impose it on their fate. In the quiet moments, Caleb found himself watching her. The way she moved, the economy of her motion, the deep well of stillness within her. She was the toughest person he had ever met, and she had never fired a shot in anger. The morning of the deadline dawned clear and cold. There had been no word. Caleb stood on the porch watching the road. He had failed. He had made a grand stand and had nothing to back it up. He would lose the ranch, Mei Lin would lose her home, and Croft would win. Just after 9 o'clock, 3 riders appeared on the horizon. The marshal, Croft, and one of Croft's men. They rode slowly, savoring the moment. Croft was smiling. They reined in at the foot of the porch. "Time's up, Thorn," the marshal said, his voice flat. He began to dismount. Caleb said nothing. He had nothing to say. He looked at Mei Lin, who stood beside him, her face impassive. He had failed her. But then another sound. A frantic drumming of hooves. A lone rider was coming up the road from Argenta, pushing his horse to a gallop. It was the telegraph boy, a skinny youth of about 16. He was waving a piece of paper. "Mr. Thorn, telegram for you. Just came through from Carson City," he yelled, breathless, as he slid his horse to a stop. He handed the flimsy paper to Caleb. Croft's smile vanished. Caleb's hands trembled as he unfolded it. The message was short. "Debt paid. Bank of Carson City holds receipt for redemption, tax collector. Consider it a long-term investment in a valley with good water and better men. Regards, A. Finch." Caleb read it twice, the words seeming to shimmer on the page. He looked up, his gaze meeting Croft's. He didn't smile. He simply handed the telegram to the marshal. The marshal read it, his eyebrows rising slightly. He looked at Croft, then back at Caleb. "It seems, Mr. Croft," he said, handing the paper back, "that the debt is settled. This property is no longer your concern." Croft stared, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. His perfect legal trap had been sprung. He had been beaten, not by a gun, but by a few words sent across a wire. Without another word, he wrenched his horse's head around and galloped away, his henchmen scrambling to follow. 6 months later, the first snow of winter dusted the high peaks of the mountains ringing the valley. The Thorn homestead was gone. In its place, filed legally at the land office in Argenta, was the Thorn Lynn Ranch. Caleb had used the remainder of Alistair Finch's investment to buy a small herd of hardy cattle and repair the outbuildings. The ranch was no longer sleeping. It was breathing, growing. Mei Lin's garden was now enclosed by a small greenhouse, its panes of glass salvaged from an abandoned stagecoach station. She sold dried herbs, vegetables, and potent goat cheese to the foreman of the railroad crews, who paid in good silver coin. The clothesline, the first thing Caleb had seen, was still there, but now Mei Lin's bright calico dresses hung beside Caleb's denim work shirts, the two colors a quiet statement against the vast, pale sky. Caleb sat on the porch, mending a piece of harness leather. The work was slow, methodical. His hands, once calloused from the grip of a pistol, were now calloused from the handle of a shovel and the reins of a plow horse. Maylin came out of the house and handed him a steaming cup of tea. She sat in the chair beside him, and they watched the cattle grazing near the creek. They did not speak often of the past, his or hers. There was no need. The present was too full. He looked out at the land, his land, their land. The glint of the creek, the solid line of the fences, the sturdy roof of the barn. He had come back here to sell a memory, to cut the last tie to a life he wanted to forget. Instead, he had found a place to anchor his future. He had spent 10 years believing that his life was defined by the man he had been. But he had learned that a man is not defined by where he has been, but by where he chooses to stand. And he had chosen to stand here. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.